Very much enjoyed all four presentations because I think they actually linked with each other quite nicely. We started with Sarah, I think, making quite a strong statement that actually we do have laws that protect those who are involved in armed conflicts, whether they are of international or non-international character. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, and the main problem is that violations happen because these laws are not obeyed. I'm talking about IHL here, which is particular body of law in context of international that applies only in situations of armed conflict and to an extent occupation. And I think moving on from violations, we're essentially moving then to post-conflict phase. And I think all other speakers gave quite practical examples of some of the key challenges faced by women living in post-conflict situations, also highlighting huge protection needs. I think I'm thinking about your talk in particular, Sarah, thinking, you just went one by one, protection of this, and that. And sometimes they can be things that we consider perhaps quite trivial in our everyday lives, but nonetheless the protection potential and needs are, I think, are not to be underestimated. I think moving on from that, we also looked at women who find themselves in situations of displacement and what other practical challenges are brought about together with this kind of context. Especially, I think I was quite glad that Frances, mentioned access to property as well, and perhaps other ways in which international actors and local actors can go about allowing women to prove their rights of ownership, which again, it was also an issue, I think, in the former Yugoslavia with women who are displaced, and yet it continues over 2 decades on in context of other more recent, more contemporary armed conflicts. And then it brings us to the issue of accountability, which I think is always a big question. International criminal law is always out there in the spotlight whenever conflicts are happening, and everybody's asking, well, we need to do away with impunity, and accountability is crucial. But as Priya highlighted, it's not only about praising accountability, it's actually how we do it and how do we treat victims and survivors of crimes in these processes, and also the need to think about gender sensitivity in this context. And I think the final point in all of that, I guess, is the question of transformation. I think both Frances and Priya mentioned the transformative potential of post-conflict phase, which I think is not just a buzz topic at the moment in sort of academic writing, but more generally is really a valid question. After all atrocities, after all horrors of conflicts, mass human rights violations, can we actually look at maybe more optimistic perspective for post-conflict phase? Does it offer an opportunity to reshape societies and reshape certain gender relations and structural problems that led to conflicts happening in the first place? And in all of that, I guess the question and the promise of reparations, something that I think all of you, one way or another, mentioned, and what these reparations would be, and can they be transformative? And if so, whose responsibility it is to award reparations, and what form of reparations are we really talking about? Are we talking about individual reparations, collective reparations? And also, I think the timing of them, earlier today, Priya mentioned justice delayed is justice denied. And I think that always lingers with me whenever we're talking not only about international criminal law processes and prosecution of mass human rights violations, international crimes, but also providing an effective remedy, including reparations for these crimes. So these are, I think, just some themes that really came out of these 4 talks, but I think I would like to now turn to the audience for any questions, comments. Please do identify yourself, and also please say whether you would like to address any particular speaker on the panel, or is it more general question or comment? It's good to be brave.
I'm fine with this. Oh, for the recording. Okay. Hello, hi. Oh, my name is Cecilia Pastaniti. I study with these four beautiful women at LSE Women, Peace and Security. So thank you very much for this inspirational panel. I have two questions really, and they're quite interlinked. We often talk about displaced women and men who then come back to their original homes, or people that have never left but that were left without a solid way to of economic means. A lot of women we know that turn to prostitution. So in the academic world, there's often the discussion of whether that is an actual choice or that is indeed forced prostitution. So my first question is, how can international law protect these women? And often we are even talking about minors. So for minors it's a bit easier maybe, but and the second question is concerning more the part of post-conflict, where we see oftentimes peacekeeping missions being involved, and they're often the perpetrators of gender-based violence. Again, how do we, or if they're not actively the perpetrators, they're the users of prostitution in loco. So how do we address that?
Would you like to address it to any particular speaker or panel as a? I'm sure that anyone willing? Yeah. Okay.
Do the second one.
Coalition of the willing. Anybody like to take that question?
Given it was kind of aimed at the UN, and I'm kind of the UN, well, sort of. Somebody who worked for the UN, at least. On the peacekeeping missions and on people turning a blind eye and using prostitution, obviously all international aid organizations, including the UN, have been shutting the door heavily since the horse has bolted, if I can put it like that. I mean, to be fair, Ban Ki-moon actually introduced some clear measures when he was Secretary General, but they were on the whole ignored, I think it's fair to say. I guess this is on the record, never mind. So I think, yeah, the UN has recognized that peacekeeping missions have violated international norms and has attempted to do something about it, but hasn't been very systematic about it, to be fair. And I think recent revelations about humanitarian organizations in general abusing situations of power and abusing children and women in those cases have meant that everybody's tightened down on it much harder. I think, though, so we now have lots of internal processes, and we've done lots of new training, and we've done and there's lots of whistleblowing things to phone and all sorts of stuff, but we have not seen a case yet properly taken internally. I mean, there are some people who brought cases and they've been pushed out. So there's a big problem, I think, in the UN about credibility, actually. And if we could see a senior man being held accountable for this, it could change dramatically the dynamics. We have now the procedures in place to do that. We have a lot of awareness raising about it, which is very positive, but we could do with the end to impunity bit as well internally. Sorry, that was a long answer. I can't answer your question on protection for prostitution. I would just say that in the Arab world, amongst feminist organizations, there's a big dispute about CEDAW's definitions of CEDAW has some protections in it for prostitutes on the grounds that possibly in some cases you might choose to be a prostitute. But in any case, there's protections for people who are in that situation, and a lot of Arab feminists think that you can never choose to be a prostitute, that it is a power dynamic, and that's the way it should be looked at.
Can I quickly add
Absolutely,
to
please.
that? I assume this is on. I just wanted to say that certainly when it comes to also a situation of conflict, and Priya, I hope you will correct me when I get this wrong, but if it's also, if the definition of coercion is extremely low when it comes to something like prostitution. You don't necessarily, of course, there may be an individual who has chosen that path, but actually there is quite a low threshold for actually considering that a relationship to be coercive in that sense. I also just wanted to make a broader point about post-conflict and conflict, because we're talking about a lot of contexts which the ICRC would consider to be still active conflict as post-conflict, and that's more than just a technicality, because it means that in terms of the response that's owed to individuals in a given context, so Iraq or Syria, for example, we sadly will be looking at a humanitarian response in those countries for a long time to come. But it also, so there's the response, and humanitarian work is not mutually exclusive with development and those frankly nor peace negotiations or peace work, and I think they should be sort of thought of in a kind of circular interacting fashion, not as a linear process. But also when it comes to the law, it means that international humanitarian law will continue to apply in something that, in a context that might be considered to be post-conflict, if actually there is an active conflict, and that then refers to the protections that would be deserved by people on the ground, both combatants and civilians.
Collins, got the microphone, so I'll
Okay.
keep it. Helen Alderson from the ICRC. I had a specific question for you, Francis. You mentioned the fact that very few women were involved in mediation processes at all. But I just wondered, do you have an example where they were? I'm looking for a good example. An example where possibly they were, and this had an impact that could really demonstrate the difference of involving women.
The example that UN Women like to use is, I think it's Liberia. I wouldn't want to entirely be quoted. The women, again, were excluded from the peace negotiations, but they had been very active on the ground at community level in doing various peacemaking. And they actually went to the negotiations because they were convinced that the men were not going to reach any agreements, that it was not going to be possible, and they actually wanted something to happen. And basically, the women were very well organized. So maybe, the lesson from it is that the women have to be super organized. They basically locked the men inside the negotiating room and refused to. So the women took control, essentially, not by being in the room, but because they hadn't been allowed in the room, but by locking the men in and telling them that they couldn't actually get out until they reached an agreement. So that was, and it may not have been Liberia, but I think it is Liberia. The point being that they actually took control over the situation, and they were very well organized. I think what happened, I mentioned Libya because it's so outrageous. I mean, even the UN, to be honest, didn't notice that the women were not going to be in this meeting in Italy. As I say, saved by the Canadians. And again, the women proved that they were the ones who were better at languages. So while you have all these international mediators, they're not always very good at speaking Arabic, to be honest. And so the women could speak Italian, and the women could speak some English. And so what happened was that the few women who ended up there ended up as the mediators between the different groups who were there. So they proved their use. But it's hard to get to the table, and what's happened with creating these separate bodies, as UN Women's tried to do, is that there is a lot of criticism of that because it's meant that they've been sidelined. So you have a women's advisory panel, so the Secretary General's special representative speaks to the advisory panel, but the women are over there somewhere. They're not part of the main negotiation. So I don't think we've got there yet.
Can I maybe also add, because I gave a talk earlier today at DFID on gender and humanitarian work, and also then this evening, and looking around, it's mainly female faces in both presentations, and it's great to have women here, but it's that, I wonder whether this is also a kind of extension of that issue, that if these messages and this sort of recepted kind of what should follow, the norms of behaviour, are not being heard by a significant proportion of people who are colleagues of us all who are working, and then progress is only going to be so far achieved. It's just really, I find it fascinating that, especially when a talk, this was women, but when a talk is pitched as gender, it's always synonymous with women, and it's clearly that's not the reality. But it's just that lack of appeal of this subject matter to men as a generalism is odd, hopefully odd.
There was one question in front, and then we go to the back. There's a gentleman at the back as well.
Hello, folks. Thank you very much. This is a cross-panel question. I was wondering whether you thought it's actually feasible to use mobile phones to kind of empower the women and also the men who want to do the right thing on the ground. So, for example, you could have like really low data apps. Granted, in some places, women might not have access to phones, but where they do, so touching on points by Sarah C. and Priya, it might actually be easy for people to kind of see that these are actually gender-related issues which you have a right to fight for. And for sexual-related things, you don't have the stigma in your face as if you're speaking to someone. So people might be a bit more open to things. Yes, you won't get the richness as you would elsewhere. Or in Francis's point, if people are coming back to places and they don't have documentation, you could actually have apps that say, if you don't have documentation, take 20 photographs and say it has worked in region X, Y, and Z. So you have cases to quote. Or in Sarah B's case, you could actually have a list of different organizations where you could say, we trust these people. We know that, yes, they might be people who are perceived as your enemies, but these specific organizations we trust. So people then feel more comfortable. So is there scope for this, or is it just quite unrealistic to use mobile phones?
I didn't catch the last sentence you said.
So is there scope to kind of use mobile phones this way? Is it being used, or is it something that is just unreasonable?
Should I go on behalf of the humanitarian sector? I think that mobile phones are, I mean, not on behalf of all of it, but mobile phones are certainly a reality, and they're increasingly used, especially in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's a huge way, but it doesn't tend to. And I could be wrong on this, but I think that it doesn't tend to relate so much to those to legal challenges, to protection. It tends to more involve sort of what we would call assistance projects, getting things to people who are in need, and understanding data about what is going on in certain areas. But I think that what you say is, I mean, this is where we should be looking. I think there is obviously a time when face-to-face contact is absolutely essential. You know, survivors of sexual violence need clinical care within 72 hours, and that can't be delivered by a mobile phone. However, there are other elements that clearly could be, and I think that remote testimony and contacts and referrals and those networks, and I think this has to be an area which expands and improves as we go forward.
But could it not be tools that you can give people to kind of use the law? So, for example, with this Francis's point.
No, I think you're right. No, I agree with you. I mean, there are, as I said, although I think you suggested I wasn't very practical, but there are the idea of using pictures is something that is trying to be implemented on the ground. And I think that just awareness raising and people that know that, and people that know that there's been cases that are successful, and encouraging others, I think that in itself would be tremendous, because one of the problems is that people think that they've not got any rights, whereas so if they were more aware that somebody's managed to get their house back because they could show that they had a picture of them standing in front of it, I mean, that's great evidence. It's just that people don't think of it as evidence, So yeah, I think there is a lot of scope, so thank you.
Well, I can't really explain how Eyewitness exactly works, but the idea is to have an app that on the one hand facilitates survivors of sexualized violence the opportunity to, get active themselves, and without necessarily having to talk to their community or to people they know, which might then bring problems such as shame, etc. But as Priya said, obviously only in some cases. So I think the idea of these apps, and there's also another initiative called Not a Weapon of War, which is a mobile application that is supposed to bring evidence for criminal cases, particularly for survivors of sexualized violence. So you have like these different approaches, and I think the main idea is also not just to get pictures, etc., but most of all to get metadata, which is very important in order for evidence being like really reliable in an international criminal procedure. So I think at least this not a weapon of war initiative has started recently with 5 pilot projects, and I think they have been started in Syria, Iraq. Well, maybe you can look it up. I don't know right now, but yeah, there's some very interesting initiatives.
I think we've got one more question at the back, and yeah.
On the eyewitness, actually, because it's an initiative of the International Bar Association. So I just wanted to add, it's basically what you said, it's just a way of collecting evidence in a way that would comply with international standards. So you would record videos, short videos, pictures. It also collects all this metadata, so GPS location and so on. And then all the information collected on the ground with a simple mobile phone is then sent to the office in London and then analyzed by lawyers, and then which is then help build cases. So recently there is a case, I think it was in Switzerland, I can't remember, sorry, I forgot even which country, but that there was one conviction thanks to the evidence collected through the Eyewitness app and also with the help of Trial International. So it's an initiative which is developing, is being used in many countries. It hasn't been used in Syria for the simple reason that they don't trust the app. Now there is a trust issue. But I think if you know anyone, and I mean probably it's also the other app you were referring to, I think it's important to encourage first responders in country to use those applications, because nowadays everyone has a mobile phone, and it really ensures that evidence is collected in a way that complies with international standards, which unfortunately is not the case in a lot of instances. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this will be the last question for the session. Before we close, it was the gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is James Oporia Ekwaro. I teach international politics at University College London. I would like to take you back to the Ugandan example.
I thought so. I heard Opoyo.
No, it's not a lot.
Okay.
I agree with you. The role of fear is very important. That's fundamental. But I think there's another factor.
Okay.
Let me put it this way. When you're a thief in an African market, a crowded African market, when they shout thief and they point at you, your chance of survival is to run very fast, pointing ahead, saying, thief. Someone else is the thief. Yeah. So you run very, very hard, saying you're running after the thief. This is the way President Museveni has handled ICC. And the world accepted the logic of it. It is not him who is the thief, it is the LRA.
Yeah.
So the sophistication, the complexity of the opponent to what we are discussing here should be accepted, should be understood very well. It's a very sophisticated regime. When the ICC came to fruition, many of us said, now we got him. Lo and behold, he turned it around and said, no, thief is over there.
Hey, thank you very much. I think we have to stop here because our time is up. But thank you very much to all 4 panelists for fascinating talks.